What would you do if you discovered that the person you married, the one who sleeps beside you each night, who knows your deepest secrets, who shares your name and your future, was not who they claimed to be? What if their entire identity was crafted for a single purpose, to take everything you have? In the autumn of 1892, as golden wheat fields stretched across the Kansas plains and the industrial prosperity of America continued its relentless march westward, a peculiar case unfolded that would challenge the fundamental trust upon which society is built. The details of what became known as the Bridgewater Deception were methodically documented by investigators, yet deliberately obscured from public record, not by the perpetrators, but by those who feared the implications of such calculated manipulation might spread like contagion through the social fabric of a nation still defining itself. The first indication that something was amiss came on September 12, 1892, when Eleanor Whitfield, the 20-year-old daughter of railroad magnate Harrison Whitfield, made a disturbing discovery while sorting through her husband's personal effects. Having been married to Thomas Bridgewater for just over 6 months, Eleanor was organizing her husband's study while he was away on business in Chicago. It was then that she found a curious notebook hidden behind a false panel in his writing desk, a location she discovered only when a glass of water spilled, causing the wood to swell and reveal the hidden compartment. I still remember the leather binding, worn at the edges, and the strange symbol embossed on the cover, like a tree with 2 identical branches, Eleanor later testified in a sworn affidavit. When I opened it, the pages were filled with handwritten notes comparing 2 men, Thomas and Timothy, physical measurements, mannerisms, speech patterns, handwriting samples, all documented with scientific precision. And with mounting horror, I realized one of these men was my husband, and the entries chronicled how he had been taught to become someone else. The journal contained detailed observations dating back to 1874, when the subjects, referred to only as Subject A and Subject B, were approximately 4 years old. The clinical nature of the entries suggested they had been written by someone with medical training, possibly a physician. More disturbing were the references to conditioning techniques and identity transference protocols that had been employed on the subjects over a period of nearly 18 years. County Sheriff Willis Montgomery was initially skeptical when Eleanor Whitfield Bridgewater appeared at his office in Topeka on the morning of September 14th. Women of her social standing rarely ventured into the sheriff's office unescorted, and her agitated state, combined with the fantastical nature of her claims, gave him pause. It was only when she produced the journal, along with letters she had subsequently discovered hidden in the same compartment, that Montgomery began to consider the possibility that her fears were founded in truth. Mrs. Bridgewater presented evidence suggesting a complex deception that, if proven true, would constitute one of the most elaborate cases of fraud I have encountered in my 23 years of law enforcement, Montgomery wrote in his initial report. The documentation indicates potential involvement of multiple parties across several states, and possibly the exploitation of other wealthy families beyond the Whitfields. Montgomery assigned his most experienced deputy, James Harrington, to investigate the matter discreetly. Harrington's first task was to verify Thomas Bridgewater's background and connections. According to the story Thomas had provided upon his arrival in Topeka society 2 years prior, he was the sole heir to a modest shipping business based in Boston, having relocated westward to explore new commercial opportunities. He presented himself as educated, cultured, and possessed of the refined manners that marked him as a gentleman of good breeding. Within 3 days of beginning his investigation, Deputy Harrington discovered that no shipping company under the name Bridgewater Maritime existed in Boston records, nor was there any Thomas Bridgewater registered as having attended Harvard University, as he had claimed. What Harrington did find, however, was a disturbing pattern of similar cases across 3 states, Missouri, Illinois, and New York. where young men of nearly identical description had ingratiated themselves into wealthy families, only to disappear with substantial portions of their new wives' inheritance. The most troubling discovery came when Harrington, following a lead from a Missouri detective with whom he corresponded, obtained a daguerreotype of one Timothy Bradford, who had married the daughter of a St. Louis banking family in 1890. The physical resemblance to Thomas Bridgewater was remarkable, yet subtle differences in facial structure suggested they were not the same person, but rather remarkably similar individuals, possibly twins. "The likeness between the two men is uncanny," wrote Harrington in his field notes. "While not identical in every feature, they share the same build, similar facial structure, and even the same pattern of gesture, as described by witnesses who knew both men. Were I to encounter them separately, I would likely consider them the same person." As Eleanor remained secluded in her father's estate, under the protection of private guards, Thomas Bridgewater returned from Chicago on September 20th. Unaware that his deception had been discovered, he was met at the train station by two of Montgomery's deputies and brought in for questioning. The initial interrogation yielded nothing. Bridgewater maintained his identity with unwavering conviction, dismissing the journal as the creative writing of his wife, whom he suggested might be suffering from nervous exhaustion. It was only after 48 hours of detention, when presented with evidence of the identical schemes in other states and the daguerreotype of Timothy Bradford, that Bridgewater's composure finally fractured. What followed was a confession so methodical and chilling that the court stenographer later requested to be reassigned, claiming the transcript had given him persistent nightmares. "I was 4 years old when they took me from the orphanage," read the transcript of Bridgewater's confession. "My earliest memory is of being placed in a room with another boy who looked just like me. We were told we were special because we were identical, and that we had been chosen for important work. They never told us we were brothers, but I always felt it. For years we were raised to mimic each other perfectly, our walks, our handwriting, even the way we laughed. By the time we were 12, I could become Timothy, and he could become Thomas with such precision that even our instructors sometimes became confused. The instructors Bridgewater referred to were revealed to be a married couple, Dr. Everett and Margaret Spencer, who had operated a private academy in a remote area of Pennsylvania since the early 1870s. According to records later seized from their property, the Spencers had systematically acquired identical twin boys from orphanages across the eastern seaboard, preferentially selecting those with appealing physical characteristics and above-average intelligence. The purpose of this collection of twins, as outlined in Dr. Spencer's private research journals, was to create pairs of interchangeable identities that could be deployed for various deceptions. The twins were raised in isolation from the outside world, subjected to rigorous training in etiquette, diction, academic subjects, and physical conditioning. Most disturbing were the psychological techniques employed to ensure absolute loyalty to their family and to instill a complete disregard for the moral implications of their future actions. "The subject must understand that identity is merely a construct," wrote Dr. Spencer in one particularly disturbing entry. "By the age of 16, each pair should be able to exchange personalities completely, maintaining the deception indefinitely. They must believe that their true self is not tied to name or history, but to their function within our design." When shown this passage during his interrogation, Thomas Bridgewater reportedly nodded with a vacant expression. "He told us our real names didn't matter," Bridgewater stated. "What mattered was that we were instruments of a greater purpose. Dr. Spencer said we were part of a redistribution of wealth that would correct the imbalances of society." As investigators pieced together the full scope of the operation, a disturbing pattern emerged. Each pair of twins was dispatched to different regions of the country once they reached adulthood. While one twin established himself in a community and worked to identify suitable marriage prospects from wealthy families, the other remained in reserve, continuing to perfect the shared identity and occasionally exchanging places to provide his brother with rest periods away from the deception. Once a marriage was secured and sufficient wealth accessed, the active twin would manufacture a reason for travel, during which time the brothers would exchange places again. The twin, who had not been part of the marriage, would then liquidate assets, often through elaborate but legal financial maneuvers that transferred wealth to anonymous accounts before disappearing. Meanwhile, the original twin would establish a new identity in another region, continuing the cycle. We've identified at least 7 pairs of twins operating across 12 states, Sheriff Montgomery reported to the governor of Kansas in October 1892. The combined financial impact of their fraudulent activities exceeds $2 million, affecting some of the nation's most prominent families. What remains unclear is where this money has gone, and who beyond the Spencers may be orchestrating this elaborate network of deception. Eleanor Whitfield's fortunate discovery of the journal had unwittingly exposed only one branch of what investigators soon discovered was an extensive criminal enterprise. As federal authorities became involved, evidence suggested that the Spencers Academy was merely one of several such operations, each specializing in different forms of long-term confidence schemes. During a raid on the Spencers' Pennsylvania compound in late October, authorities discovered not only extensive records of their twin training program, but also evidence of communication with similar operations in Europe. Letters exchanged with correspondents in Vienna, London, and Paris suggested that the methodology had been imported from European practitioners who had refined these techniques over generations. "We stand at the threshold of a new scientific understanding of identity," wrote Dr. Spencer in a letter to an associate in Vienna, dated 1888. "Your success with the Rothman twins proves that our approach transcends cultural boundaries. The American experiment proceeds according to plan, though we have modified certain conditioning protocols to account for the peculiar emphasis on individualism in this country." For Eleanor Whitfield, the revelation that her husband of 6 months was part of such an elaborate deception caused a profound psychological crisis. In a private journal recovered from her bedroom following her death in 1920, she wrote, "I still dream of Thomas, or whoever he truly was. In these dreams, I see 2 of him standing before me, and I am asked to choose which one is real. But the horrible truth is that neither was real. Both were fabrications, personas crafted by unseen hands for purposes I still cannot fully comprehend. What haunts me most is not the betrayal, but the realization that I shared my most intimate self with someone who existed only as a carefully constructed fiction." The investigation expanded throughout the winter of 1892 and into 1893, revealing increasingly disturbing details about the scope and sophistication of the operation. In January, federal agents traced banking records to a series of property investments throughout the Western Territories, suggesting that the proceeds from these marriages were being channeled into land speculation as the frontier continued to develop. What happened next would dramatically alter the course of the investigation and raise troubling questions about the extent to which powerful interests may have been complicit in concealing the full truth from the public. On February 3, 1893, as Sheriff Montgomery and Deputy Harrington were traveling by train to Washington, D.C., with their accumulated evidence to brief federal authorities, their private compartment caught fire under mysterious circumstances. Both men perished, along with all the documentation they had gathered. The official report cited a heating malfunction, though multiple witnesses later claimed to have seen someone enter their compartment shortly before the fire was detected. Harrison Whitfield, using his considerable influence as a railroad magnate, demanded a thorough investigation into the deaths. However, his efforts were systematically obstructed by bureaucratic delays and jurisdictional disputes between state and federal authorities. Within 3 weeks of beginning his crusade for justice, Whitfield himself suffered a fatal stroke while working late in his study. His personal secretary reported that he had been reviewing documents related to the Bridgewater case just before his collapse. With the primary investigators and the most powerful advocate for the case deceased, the investigation lost momentum. Thomas Bridgewater, who had been held in the Topeka jail awaiting trial, was found dead in his cell on March 12th, an apparent suicide by hanging. Without the primary suspect, and with much of the evidence destroyed, prosecutors struggled to build a case against the Spencers, who maintained that their academy was merely a specialized educational institution for gifted children. The Topeka Daily Capital published a brief account of the case on March 15, 1893, describing it as a complex fraud scheme involving marital deception, but omitting many of the more disturbing elements that had emerged during the investigation. 3 days later, the paper printed a retraction and apology, citing factual inaccuracies in their reporting, though the specific errors were never identified. By April 1893, public mentions of the case had all but disappeared from newspapers across the country. The Spencers were released due to insufficient evidence, their academy was closed, and they relocated to an unknown destination. The other twins, who had been identified during the investigation, similarly vanished, some leaving behind confused and devastated spouses who struggled to comprehend how thoroughly they had been deceived. One crucial piece of evidence survived, however, a partial copy of Dr. Spencer's research journal that had been sent to a colleague at the Boston Medical Society before the investigation became public. This document, rediscovered in the Society's archives in 1927 by medical historian Dr. Howard Phillips, contained a disturbing passage that suggested the twins program was merely one aspect of a more ambitious endeavor. The twin project represents only the first phase of our work. Once we have perfected the methodology for creating interchangeable identities, we can proceed to the more profound challenge, the complete erasure and reconstruction of the self. Preliminary results with subjects 7 and 8 indicate that through proper conditioning, we can remove all traces of original identity and replace it with our constructed version. The implications for society are limitless. Imagine individuals whose very essence is designed rather than developed, whose loyalties are programmed rather than earned. In a marginal note beside this passage, an unidentified reader had written, "The committee approves progression to Phase 2. Select subjects from Group C for initial implementation. Funding increased accordingly." The identity of the committee referenced in this note has never been conclusively established, though subsequent investigations have uncovered tantalizing connections to various prominent industrialists and political figures of the era. What is clear is that by the turn of the century, several graduates of institutions similar to the Spencers Academy had attained positions of significant influence in banking, industry, and government across the United States. As for the fate of Timothy Bridgewater, Thomas's twin brother, who had perpetrated the similar fraud in St. Louis, records indicate he was never apprehended. A man matching his description was reported to have boarded a steamship bound for Europe in April 1893, traveling under the name Edward Caldwell. Intriguingly, an E. Caldwell appears in the guest registry of several prestigious Vienna social events in the autumn of that year, described as an American businessman with considerable interest in psychological research. The implications of the Bridgewater case extend far beyond a mere series of financial frauds. What began as an investigation into marital deception revealed glimpses of a more profound conspiracy, one that sought to exploit the malleability of human identity for purposes that remain obscured by time and deliberate concealment. Perhaps most unsettling is the possibility that similar operations continued long after the Bridgewater case faded from public awareness. Census records from 1900 through 1920 show several instances of children, particularly twins, disappearing from orphanages throughout the country with minimal investigation by authorities. Whether these disappearances represent a continuation of the Spencers' work or mere statistical anomalies has never been definitively determined. In 1917, a Kansas City socialite named Catherine Pembroke created a minor scandal when she publicly accused her husband of 4 years, industrialist William Pembroke, of being an imposter. Though she was quickly institutionalized for nervous exhaustion and her claims dismissed as delusions, several witnesses reported that before her commitment, she had mentioned finding a journal with 2 identical branches embossed on its cover. The true extent of the Bridgewater deception and how far its tendrils may have reached into American society remains unknown. What records survive suggest a coordinated effort to manipulate human development at its most fundamental level, creating individuals who existed not as autonomous beings, but as carefully crafted tools for specific purposes. For those who have studied the fragmented evidence of this case, one question persists. If such methods were being perfected in the late 19th century, how might they have evolved in the decades that followed? And more troubling still, how many of us might carry within our most intimate relationships the ghost of a deception we have yet to uncover? As you consider these questions, perhaps you might take a moment to truly look at those closest to you, not just at their familiar features, but at the subtle patterns of behavior that constitute their identity, and ask yourself, how well can we ever truly know another person? How certain can we be that those we love are who they claim to be? The archivists who periodically revisit this case often report a curious phenomenon, a persistent feeling that they themselves are being observed as they examine the remaining documentation. As one researcher from the Smithsonian Institution noted in 1962, the more deeply one delves into the Bridgewater materials, the more one senses that the investigation itself is being monitored by unseen observers. Perhaps this is mere paranoia induced by the subject matter, but I cannot shake the feeling that by studying this case, I have inadvertently drawn attention from those who would prefer it remain forgotten. In the small town of Harlow, Kansas, just 30 miles from where the Whitfield estate once stood, local historians maintain that on certain autumn nights, visitors to the town cemetery report seeing a woman in period dress moving among the graves. According to these accounts, she approaches visitors and asks a single question: "Are you who you appear to be?" Before they can answer, she vanishes, leaving behind only the faint scent of lavender, the same perfume Eleanor Whitfield was known to favor. The great work continues. Have you ever wondered what secrets lie buried in your family history? What if the stories you were told about your grandparents and great-grandparents were carefully constructed lies meant to conceal a truth too disturbing to acknowledge? As our investigation into the Bridgewater case continued through decades of obscured records and mysterious disappearances, a pattern emerged suggesting that what began in 1892 never truly ended. It merely evolved. By the early 1900s, the public had largely forgotten the strange case of Thomas Bridgewater and the twins who had been trained to deceive wealthy families. Yet in certain circles, particularly among those tasked with protecting the nation's most powerful families, the case remained a cautionary tale of how thoroughly identity could be fabricated and trust exploited. Samuel Pinkerton, son of the famous detective Alan Pinkerton and head of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency's Midwest Division, maintained a private file on what his agents called the doppelganger cases. This file, sealed until 1976 as part of the agency's confidential records, revealed that Pinkerton operatives had tracked at least 23 incidents between 1894 and 1915 that bore the hallmarks of the Bridgewater methodology. "These are not common confidence schemes," Pinkerton wrote in a confidential 1898 report to a consortium of banking families who had retained his agency's services. The level of preparation and psychological conditioning evident in these cases suggests an organization with resources far beyond those of typical criminal enterprises. More concerning is the pattern of strategic targeting. The subjects consistently position themselves to access not just wealth, but influence over critical industries and political appointments. Pinkerton's investigators uncovered evidence that several prominent business mergers during this period had been facilitated by marriages that later proved suspicious. In each case, the husband had appeared in the social circle approximately 2 years before the marriage, with impeccable but ultimately unverifiable credentials. Following the merger or acquisition, these men typically died under unusual circumstances or disappeared during business trips, leaving their widows confused and often financially compromised despite their family's apparent wealth. We have confirmed 3 cases where men bearing remarkable physical resemblance to deceased or disappeared husbands were later observed in foreign capitals, operating under new identities, noted Pinkerton agent James McParland in a field report from 1903. Most recently, a man bearing striking resemblance to the late Edward Holloway of Chicago was observed at a private club in Vienna, engaged in close conversation with several Austrian industrialists. When our operative attempted to photograph this individual, he was forcibly removed from the premises by security personnel who claimed to be associated with a private research foundation. The reference to Vienna repeatedly surfaced throughout the investigation, suggesting a connection to European interests that predated the American operation. Archival research conducted in the 1960s by historian Margaret Caldwell, a name that raises questions given its similarity to the alias used by Timothy Bridgewater, uncovered references to a Gesellschaft für Identitätsforschung, Society for Identity Research, operating in Vienna from 1870 through 1914. This organization, ostensibly dedicated to psychological research, maintained correspondence with several American physicians, including Dr. Everett Spencer. Among the fragmentary records of this society that survived the world wars was a disturbing philosophical treatise attributed to its founder, Dr. Wilhelm Krauss. The document, translated from German in 1968, contained passages that shed light on the ideological underpinnings of the twin program. "Identity, as commonly understood, is the most persistent illusion of the modern age," Krauss wrote. "The belief in a continuous, coherent self that persists from birth to death is a fiction that serves social stability, but has no basis in scientific fact. Our research demonstrates conclusively that identity can be deliberately constructed, deconstructed, and reconstructed according to design. The implications are profound. If the self is merely a collection of habits, memories, and conditioned responses, then those who control the conditioning process control the very essence of humanity." Krauss went on to outline a multi-generational project to demonstrate this philosophy through practical application, describing a process whereby carefully selected subjects would be molded from earliest childhood to embody specific identities designed for particular purposes. The twins program, he noted, represented merely the initial experimental phase of a more ambitious undertaking, the creation of purpose-built humans whose entire conception of self would be engineered to serve specific functions within society. "The ultimate goal," Krauss concluded, "is not merely to create interchangeable identities, but to develop methodologies by which human development can be directed with scientific precision. Within 3 generations, we envision a system whereby individuals can be cultivated to fulfill specific social, economic, and political functions without awareness that their selfhood has been externally determined. The discovery of these documents in 1968 prompted a discreet investigation by certain elements within the U.S. intelligence community, particularly those concerned with the potential for foreign psychological operations. This investigation, never officially acknowledged, connected the historical Bridgewater case to more contemporary concerns about long-term infiltration and influence operations. The trail leading from the Spencer Academy to subsequent operations proved difficult to follow, as records had been systematically destroyed or altered. However, land registry documents revealed that properties formerly owned by the Spencer's associates were transferred in 1905 to a corporate entity called Theseus Educational Foundation, which established a series of exclusive boarding schools throughout the northeastern United States. These schools, which operated from 1906 through 1942, specifically recruited orphan children, particularly twins, offering free education to those who met their rigorous selection criteria. Publicly, the foundation was celebrated for its philanthropic work, providing opportunities to disadvantaged children. Internal records, partially recovered from a fire that destroyed the foundation's headquarters in 1944, tell a different story. Subject Group D continues to show remarkable progress in identity transference protocols, reads one quarterly report from 1927. The modified conditioning techniques have reduced resistance by 67% compared to previous cohorts. Of particular note is the twin pairing designated Archer Alpha and Archer Beta, who can now exchange roles with no detectable differentiation, even under stress-induced scenarios. Their placement assessments indicate suitability for the financial sector program, with projected implementation by 1932. More disturbing are references to memory modification protocols and personality overwriting techniques that appear in later documents, suggesting that by the 1930s, the program had advanced beyond training subjects to adopt alternative identities and had begun experimenting with more fundamental alterations to memory and selfhood. The story of John and James Archer provides a rare documented case where the veil of secrecy surrounding these operations was momentarily lifted. Born in 1913 and orphaned during the influenza pandemic of 1918, the Archer twins were among the children rescued by the Theseus Educational Foundation. According to Foundation records, they excelled in their studies and were being groomed for positions in the banking industry. In 1938, John Archer was placed as a junior executive at First National Bank of Boston, while his brother James remained at the Foundation's main campus in upstate New York. Over the next 4 years, John advanced rapidly through the ranks, becoming personal assistant to the bank's aging president, William Harrison. When Harrison's daughter Catherine returned from finishing school in Europe in 1942, she and John began a courtship that led to their engagement later that year. What happened next would have remained buried in private family correspondence if not for the tenacity of Catherine Harrison's granddaughter, Elizabeth Harrison Mercer, who in 1997 began researching her family history for what she thought would be a simple genealogical project. Among her grandfather's papers, Harrison Mercer discovered a series of increasingly frantic letters from Catherine to her father in the weeks before her wedding. The final letter, dated December 7, 1942, notably the first anniversary of Pearl Harbor, contained a passage that led Harrison Mercer to contact authorities. "Father, I am not suffering from pre-wedding nerves, as you suggest. Something is terribly wrong with John. 3 nights ago, I went to his apartment to bring him soup when he was ill. He was delirious with fever, and as I tended to him, he spoke to me as if I were someone named Dr. Thorne, saying that the implementation is proceeding as scheduled, but that he was experiencing breakthrough memories that should have been suppressed. When I questioned him the next day, he had no recollection of the conversation and became uncharacteristically angry at my persistence. Most troubling, when I mentioned visiting him at his apartment on Marlborough Street, he insisted he had been at his club all evening and that I must have dreamed the encounter. Father, I fear something sinister is happening, and I'm not certain the man I am to marry in 2 weeks is who he claims to be. The wedding never took place. According to society pages from December 1942, Catherine Harrison suffered a nervous collapse and was sent to a private sanitarium in Vermont to recover. John Archer resigned his position at the bank, citing a desire to join the war effort. Military records show a John Archer enlisted in the army in January 1943 and was reported killed in action in the Pacific Theater in 1944. However, when Harrison Mercer attempted to locate her grandmother's medical records from the Vermont Sanitarium, she discovered that the facility had never existed at the address provided in family correspondence. Further investigation revealed that Catherine Harrison had actually been taken to a private facility in western Massachusetts, owned by a subsidiary of the Theseus Educational Foundation. Catherine emerged from this facility in April 1943 with no memory of John Archer or her allegations against him. She later married Richard Mercer, a business associate of her father's, and by all accounts lived a normal, if somewhat subdued life until her death in 1989. According to her private nurse, in her final days, Catherine occasionally became agitated, asking visitors if they were real or one of the doubles. As for James Archer, John's twin brother, Foundation records indicate he was reassigned to European operations in early 1943. His subsequent activities are unknown, though a James Archer appears in CIA files from the 1950s as a special consultant on psychological operations with extensive experience in Central Europe. The Theseus Educational Foundation officially dissolved following the Second World War, citing financial difficulties. Its assets were transferred to various charitable trusts, and its remaining students were placed in conventional boarding schools. What became of the program's architects and the children who had been subjected to their methodologies remains largely unknown, though tantalizing clues occasionally surface in declassified government documents and private correspondence. One such clue appeared in 1967 when Dr. Martin Thornfield, a respected psychiatrist specializing in memory disorders, published a controversial paper titled "Constructed Identities: Case Studies in Profound Memory Integration." The paper detailed 3 anonymous cases of individuals who appeared to have entire false life histories implanted through sophisticated psychological conditioning. Thornfield's research was widely dismissed by his peers, and he withdrew from academic life shortly after publication. His personal papers, examined after his death in 1982, revealed that he had been a graduate of a Theseus Foundation school and had spent 3 years studying in Vienna before establishing his practice in the United States. The subjects described in my research represent only those cases where the programming developed flaws, Thornfield wrote in unpublished notes found among his effects. The truly successful subjects, and I believe there are many, would never be identified, as they themselves have no awareness of their constructed nature. They move through society fulfilling their designated functions, believing themselves to be autonomous individuals while executing the long-term objectives implanted during their conditioning. The perfect operative is one who never knows he is an operative. The most disturbing aspect of Thornfield's notes was his suggestion that the program had not ended with Theseus, but had evolved and dispersed into various institutional forms, some operating under the auspices of government research, others within private psychological foundations, and still others embedded within certain exclusive educational institutions. The methodology has been refined to the point where physical resemblance is no longer necessary, Thornfield wrote. Modern techniques allow for the creation of functional identities based purely on psychological conditioning and targeted memory implantation. The twins were merely the beginning, the proof of concept for what has become a far more sophisticated enterprise. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, scattered reports emerged of individuals experiencing what psychologists termed identity breakdown episodes. Cases where seemingly stable individuals suddenly claimed to have awakened to the realization that their memories and sense of self were somehow artificial. Most of these cases were diagnosed as delusional disorders, and the subjects typically recanted after treatment with psychiatric medications. However, investigative journalist Robert Carmichael, who tracked dozens of such cases between 1974 and 1991, noted troubling patterns. In a manuscript rejected by multiple publishers and eventually self-published in 1993, Carmichael documented that nearly 60% of these cases involved individuals in positions of significant influence: executives at major corporations, advisors to political figures, directors of cultural institutions, and academicians at prestigious universities. More concerning is the pattern of intervention that follows these episodes. Within days of the initial breakdown, these individuals are invariably visited by specialists from one of a handful of psychiatric institutes, all of which can be traced through shell companies to a common corporate parent, the Prometheus Cognitive Research Group. Carmichael's investigation ended abruptly in 1993, when he died in what authorities ruled a single-vehicle accident on a rural road in Vermont. The statistical clustering of these breakdowns among individuals in positions that would be considered strategically valuable from an influence operations perspective cannot be coincidental, Carmichael argued. His research materials were destroyed in a house fire 2 days after his death, leaving only the self-published manuscript as evidence of his work. The publisher who had printed the limited run of Carmichael's book reported that shortly after its release, their office was broken into and their computer systems destroyed, with the only items taken being the digital files of Carmichael's manuscript and their customer list. The handful of copies that survived have become collector's items among conspiracy theorists and researchers of psychological operations, commanding prices upward of $5,000 when they occasionally appear on auction sites. Each time one surfaces, it typically disappears again within days, purchased by anonymous buyers who never relist the item. In 2003, the trail received an unexpected update when Dr. Elizabeth Harrison Mercer, who had continued investigating her grandmother's story alongside her duties as a neuropsychologist at Johns Hopkins University, published research on what she termed artificial memory architecture. Her paper, which focused on therapeutic applications for trauma patients, contained a methodology for identifying memories that had been implanted rather than naturally formed. 3 months after publication, Harrison Mercer's paper was retracted by the journal for methodological concerns, despite having passed peer review. Shortly thereafter, she took an unscheduled sabbatical, and upon her return, shifted her research focus entirely. When contacted by independent researchers interested in her original work, Harrison Mercer responded with nearly identical language in each case, stating that her previous research had been based on flawed data and that she had no interest in revisiting the topic. One colleague, speaking on condition of anonymity, reported that in the weeks before her sabbatical, Harrison Mercer had become increasingly paranoid, claiming that she was being followed and that someone had been accessing her computer and research notes. The Elizabeth who returned from sabbatical was different, this colleague noted. Her personality, her research interests, even her manner of speaking, had subtly changed. "If I didn't know better, I'd say she was a different person wearing Elizabeth's life. The digital trail of the Bridgewater case and its apparent successors becomes increasingly fragmented in recent years, with information appearing briefly on obscure forums before being scrubbed from the internet. Those who pursue the subject too publicly often report strange experiences, unexplained technical difficulties, unusual attention from unknown individuals, and in some cases, professional or personal setbacks that derail their investigations. In 2012, an anonymous source claiming to be a former employee of the Prometheus Cognitive Research Group posted a cache of documents to several whistleblower sites. The documents suggested that the original methodology developed by the Spencers and their Vienna associates had evolved into what the source described as identity architecture, a comprehensive system for creating and implementing constructed personalities designed for specific long-term purposes. According to these documents, the modern program no longer relied on twins or even physical resemblance, instead focusing on psychological conditioning so sophisticated that subjects could be activated years or even decades after their initial programming, seamlessly transitioning into predetermined roles with no awareness of their manipulation. The process begins with candidate identification, typically in early childhood, stated one document titled Implementation Protocols, Level 7 Clearance Required. Optimal subjects demonstrate high intelligence, psychological resilience, and social adaptability. Following acquisition, baseline personality assessment determines which identity template the subject will receive, with conditioning tailored to leverage existing traits rather than completely overwriting them, a refinement that has dramatically improved stability and reduced breakdown incidents. The documents described a global network of schools, therapy centers, and summer camps that served as fronts for the initial identification and assessment of potential subjects. Those selected would be flagged for special attention, their development monitored through what was described as a coordinated network of embedded observers who would report on the subject's progress throughout adolescence. Most disturbing were references to sleeper implementation and dormant identity packages that could be activated by specific trigger sequences years after the initial conditioning, causing subjects to seamlessly transition into predetermined roles with no conscious awareness of their manipulation. Within 48 hours of their posting, the documents had been removed from every site where they had appeared. Users who had downloaded copies reported that the files became corrupted, rendering them unreadable. The whistleblower account went silent, and attempts to trace it led nowhere. In 2017, the case took another unexpected turn when facial recognition researcher Dr. James Chen of MIT published a paper on what he termed micro-gesture patterning, subtle, unconscious physical mannerisms that remain consistent across individuals regardless of conscious attempts to alter behavior. Chen's research, which focused on developing more sophisticated security systems, contained a passing reference to having identified statistically impossible similarities in micro-gesture patterns among unrelated individuals in positions of influence. Before he could publish his follow-up research, Chen accepted a position with a private research foundation, and his work was classified as proprietary. Attempts to contact him have been unsuccessful, and colleagues report that his current project is unrelated to his previous research focus. The most recent development in this decade-spanning mystery came in 2023, when cybersecurity analyst Maya Rodriguez discovered unusual patterns while developing algorithms to detect deepfake videos. Rodriguez noted that certain public figures displayed micro-expression anomalies similar to those found in synthetic media, despite being unquestionably real people appearing in live, unedited footage. It's as if these individuals are themselves performing a role so deeply integrated that it manifests in the same subtle inconsistencies we observe in artificial content, Rodriguez wrote in a blog post that was removed within hours of publication. More concerning is that these anomalies appear to fluctuate over time in the same individual, with periods of natural expression alternating with periods of what my algorithm flags as performed identity. Rodriguez's research notes, shared privately with colleagues before her sudden career change to corporate finance later that year, included a disturbing observation. The individuals flagged by her algorithm often appeared in proximity to major policy decisions, corporate mergers, or cultural inflection points that significantly altered the direction of institutions or even national discourse. The pattern suggests strategic placement and activation, she wrote. These individuals emerge at critical junctures, exert influence that alters institutional trajectory, then either fade from prominence or return to baseline behavioral patterns once the objective is achieved. It bears all the hallmarks of a coordinated long-term operation, though by whom and to what ultimate end remains unclear. For those who have followed the fragmentary trail from the Bridgewater twins to modern concerns about identity architecture, certain patterns become clear despite deliberate obfuscation. What began as a relatively crude operation using physically similar individuals to perpetrate financial fraud appears to have evolved into something far more sophisticated, a systematic methodology for shaping human development to create individuals designed for specific functions. The ultimate purpose of such a program remains the subject of speculation. Some researchers suggest it represents a century-long effort by certain financial interests to maintain control over economic systems, while others point to ideological motivations rooted in the pseudo-scientific theories that emerged in late 19th century Europe. Still others, particularly those with backgrounds in intelligence operations, see evidence of a patient, multi-generational approach to infiltration and influence that transcends traditional notions of espionage. What seems increasingly certain is that the Bridgewater case, far from being an isolated historical curiosity, represented the visible portion of a much larger enterprise that continues to evolve and operate beneath the surface of contemporary society. The full scope and current manifestation of this enterprise remain hidden, glimpsed only through the rare instances where its methodologies develop flaws or its operations briefly intersect with public awareness. For the average person, such revelations might seem abstract, the stuff of conspiracy theories and speculative fiction. Yet the implications touch on the most fundamental aspects of human experience: the nature of identity, the reliability of memory, and the very concept of autonomous selfhood. As you move through your daily life, interacting with colleagues, friends, and even family members, consider the subtle patterns of behavior that constitute their identities. Consider how well you really know the people closest to you, or indeed how well you know yourself. How certain are you that your memories, preferences, and sense of purpose are truly your own, rather than the product of influences so deeply embedded that they have become indistinguishable from your authentic self? Perhaps the most unsettling legacy of the Bridgewater case is not the specific deceptions it uncovered, but the questions it raises about the malleability of human identity. Questions that become increasingly relevant in an age where the boundaries between authentic and constructed experience grow ever more blurred. In a quiet corner of the Harvard University archives, among the papers of Dr. William James, the pioneering psychologist whose work on consciousness and identity helped shape modern understanding of the self, there exists a curious document. It is a letter dated 1895, addressed to James from a former student whose name has been carefully excised from the page. On the back of this letter, James wrote a single sentence that perhaps best captures the enduring significance of the Bridgewater case and its aftermath. If identity can be manufactured by design rather than formed through natural development, then who among us can claim with certainty to be the author of our own selves? As technologies for influencing human behavior grow more sophisticated and our understanding of consciousness evolves, this question becomes not merely philosophical, but practical. The content of the letter is equally curious, consisting primarily of technical observations about memory formation and identity construction that would have been remarkably advanced for the period. The boundary between authentic selfhood and external influence blurs, not only through deliberate manipulation, but through the subtle conditioning of modern life. The Bridgewater twins and their successors may represent an extreme case of identity construction, but they exist on a continuum that includes the more commonplace influences that shape all human development. The difference lies not in the fact of external shaping, but in the deliberate, strategic nature of the process and the absence of the subject's informed consent. For those who continue to investigate this shadowy enterprise, the work is fraught with obstacles and dangers. Information disappears, witnesses recant or vanish, and those who probe too deeply often find themselves facing personal or professional crises that derail their efforts. Yet, fragments of evidence continue to emerge, suggesting that whatever began in that remote Pennsylvania academy in the late 19th century continues to evolve and operate beneath the surface of contemporary society. The most recent indication that the program remains active came in the form of a peculiar obituary published in the Boston Globe in February 2024. It announced the death of Dr. Thomas Spencer, aged 97, described as a pioneer in educational psychology and founder of the Cognitive Development Institute. The obituary noted that Dr. Spencer was survived by his identical twin brother, Dr. Timothy Spencer, and that in lieu of flowers, donations could be made to the Theseus Memorial Scholarship Fund. No record of a Cognitive Development Institute exists in any academic database, nor is there any mention of either Thomas or Timothy Spencer in the published literature of educational psychology. The Theseus Memorial Scholarship Fund, when contacted, proved to be a shell entity that accepted donations but had no discernible connection to any educational institution. When a reporter from a local news blog attempted to follow up on these discrepancies, she was informed by the Globe that the obituary had been placed and paid for by a corporate entity called Bridgewater Associates, a name that bears no relation to the well-known hedge fund of the same name, and which could not be traced to any registered business. The reporter's subsequent effort to investigate this story was cut short when she accepted an unexpected job offer from a prestigious national newspaper, relocating across the country 1 week after beginning her inquiries. Her blog post about the mysterious obituary was removed, and she has not returned to the subject in her subsequent journalism. For those who recognize the significance of these names and their historical connections, the message could not be clearer. The work that began with the Bridgewater twins continues, adapting to modern conditions while maintaining its core methodology and purpose across generations. What that purpose might be, and how extensively it has shaped the world in which we live, remains a question without definitive answer. What seems increasingly clear, however, is that somewhere beyond the awareness of mainstream society, the systematic production of constructed identities continues. Individuals designed to serve specific functions move among us, believing themselves to be autonomous beings while executing purposes implanted through methodologies refined over more than a century of psychological research and application. As you finish reading this account, you might feel a sense of skepticism, perhaps even dismissal, After all, such elaborate conspiracies rarely withstand scrutiny in the harsh light of rational analysis. Yet before you set these concerns aside entirely, take a moment to consider a simple question. How would you know if your own identity, your memories, values, and sense of purpose had been shaped by design rather than developed naturally? By what mechanism could you distinguish between authentic selfhood and a skillfully implanted construct? The most perfect prison, after all, is one whose walls are invisible to those confined within them. In the words attributed to Dr. Wilhelm Krauss in his final correspondence before disappearing from historical record, when identity itself becomes the medium of control, those who are controlled will forever believe themselves free. This is our great work, and it will continue long after we who began it have returned to dust. The great work continues.